So here you are, lying somewhere comfortable. Maybe the lights are low. Maybe the world outside has gone quiet, and you're just letting your mind settle. And I want to tell you something. Right now, as you're listening to this, there are roughly 10,000 commercial aircraft in the sky. 10,000. Some of them are over oceans, some are threading between mountain ranges, some are climbing through thunderstorms. Each one is a hollow aluminum tube, pressurized like a soda can, hurtling through air so thin and cold that a human being couldn't survive in it for more than a couple of minutes unprotected. And every single one of them is flying because of a set of principles that took humanity thousands of years to figure out, and that most people, even frequent flyers, have never really had explained to them properly. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to go through all of it. How airplanes actually work. Not the hand-wavy version you got in school, not the oversimplified cartoon explanation, but the real thing. The physics, the engineering, the materials, the history, the failures, the breakthroughs, all of it. And we're going to take our time. There's no rush. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. That's kind of the idea. But if you stay with me, I think you'll find this genuinely fascinating, because the story of how we learned to fly is one of the greatest engineering stories ever told. Let's start at the very beginning. And I mean the very beginning. For most of human history, flight was magic. It was mythology. It was something birds did and gods did and humans absolutely did not do. Think about what it must have been like to be a person 5,000 years ago, watching an eagle ride a thermal updraft, circling higher and higher without even flapping its wings. You had no framework to understand that. No concept of air pressure. No idea that air was even a substance with weight and density. Air was just nothing. It was the absence of stuff. And yet this bird was resting on it, climbing on it, as if invisible stairs existed in the sky. The Greeks told the story of Daedalus and Icarus, the craftsman who built wings from feathers and wax so he and his son could escape the island of Crete. Icarus flew too close to the sun, the wax melted, and he fell into the sea. It's a story about hubris, sure, but it also tells you something about how the ancients understood flight. They thought it was fundamentally about the wings themselves. Build the right wings, strap them on, flap hard enough, and you'd fly. That intuition, that human-powered flapping flight should work, persisted for an absurdly long time. We're talking centuries of people building ornithopters, which is the technical name for flapping wing machines, strapping them to their arms, jumping off towers and cliffs and church steeples, and falling. Sometimes to their deaths. There's a monk named Aylmer of Malmesbury, who, around the year 1010, attached wings to his hands and feet and launched himself from the top of Malmesbury Abbey in England. He reportedly glided for about 200 meters before crashing and breaking both his legs. He was lame for the rest of his life. And you know what he concluded? He said the problem was that he forgot to add a tail, which, honestly, is a pretty astute observation for an 11th century monk who just fell off a building. But here's the thing about all these early attempts. They were doomed, and not just because the engineering was bad. They were doomed because the fundamental concept was wrong. Humans cannot fly by flapping. We just can't. Our muscles don't produce enough power per unit of body weight. A bird's flight muscles make up something like 15 to 25% of its total body mass. Our pectoral muscles are maybe 1%. And birds have hollow bones. and feathers that are engineering marvels in their own right. Each one a lightweight, flexible airfoil with interlocking barbs. We were never going to outbird the birds. The path to human flight was never going to be through imitation. It was going to be through understanding. And that understanding really started, with one person more than anyone else. Leonardo da Vinci. Now, Leonardo gets brought up so often in so many contexts that it's easy to roll your eyes a little. Oh, Leonardo predicted helicopters. Leonardo designed tanks. Leonardo was 500 years ahead of his time. But when it comes to flight, the praise is actually deserved, and for a specific reason. Leonardo was, as far as we know, the first person to sit down and systematically study how flight works as a physical phenomenon, not as a dream, not as a myth, but as a problem that could be analyzed. Between roughly 1485 and 1515, Leonardo filled notebook after notebook with observations about birds. He watched how they turned, how they adjusted their wings in gusts, how they tucked and dove and recovered. He sketched wing cross-sections. He thought about how air moved over surfaces, and he designed flying machines, yes, including ornithopters, because he hadn't fully escaped that idea, but also something much more important. He designed what we'd now recognize as a rudimentary parachute, and he sketched a device that looks remarkably like an aerial screw, a kind of proto-helicopter. But perhaps his most significant insight was something quieter than any of those inventions. He began to understand that air was a fluid, that it had substance, that when a wing moved through air, the air pushed back. He wrote about it in terms of resistance and pressure. He wasn't right about everything, not by a long stretch, but he was asking the right questions for the first time. Now, Leonardo's notebooks were private. They were written in his famous mirror script, and most of them weren't widely known or studied until centuries after his death. So his direct influence on the development of aviation was actually pretty limited. The ideas had to be rediscovered independently. But what he represents is the moment when flight shifted from mythology to engineering, from "wouldn't it be wonderful if" to "let's figure out how this actually works." And then, for a long time, not much happened. At least not on the heavier-than-air front. Because in 1783, something else entirely stole the show. The Montgolfier brothers, Joseph Michel and Jacques Etienne, launched the first successful hot air balloon flight in Annonay, France. And a few months later, in November of that year, two men, Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier and the Marquis d'Arlandes, floated over Paris in a Montgolfier balloon, becoming the first human beings to fly in any meaningful sense. They traveled about 5.5 miles in roughly 25 minutes, feeding straw into a fire to keep the air in the balloon hot. And just 10 days later, Jacques Charles and Nicolas Louis Robert flew a hydrogen balloon even farther. This was a genuine revolution. Humans were flying. But here's what's important to understand. Balloons work on a completely different principle than airplanes. A balloon flies because it's buoyant. The hot air, or hydrogen inside it, is less dense than the surrounding atmosphere, so the balloon floats, the same way a cork floats in water. There's no lift being generated by air moving over a wing. There's no aerodynamics involved in any meaningful way. A balloon is basically a boat for the sky. It goes where the wind takes it. You can go up and you can go down by adjusting your buoyancy, but you can't really steer. You're a passenger of the atmosphere. And for a surprisingly long time, a lot of very smart people thought that was good enough. That the future of flight was lighter than air. Balloons, and later dirigibles and airships. The idea that you could build something heavier than air and make it fly under its own power seemed, to many serious scientists, physically impossible. Lord Kelvin, one of the most respected physicists of the 19th century, reportedly said in 1895 that heavier-than-air flying machines were impossible. Now, whether he said exactly that is debated, but the sentiment was common among educated people of the time. The math seemed to be against it. But not everyone agreed. And this is where the story starts to get really good, because the people who cracked the problem of heavier-than-air flight weren't the ones you might expect. They weren't university professors or government-funded researchers. The most important breakthroughs came from a handful of obsessive, often self-taught individuals who just couldn't let the problem go. The first one I want to tell you about is Sir George Cayley. And if there's an unsung hero in the history of aviation, it's Cayley. Born in 1773 in Yorkshire, England, Cayley was a baronet, minor nobility, with enough money and free time to pursue whatever interested him. And what interested him from a very young age was flight. By 1799, when he was just 26 years old, Cayley had done something remarkable. He had identified the 4 forces that act on a flying machine: lift, weight, thrust, and drag. He engraved a small silver disc, you can still see it in the Science Museum in London, with a diagram showing these 4 forces acting on a fixed-wing aircraft. A fixed wing, not a flapping wing. Cayley understood, more clearly than anyone before him, that the wing's job was to generate lift, and that thrust, the force that moves the aircraft forward, should come from a separate mechanism. He separated the problem of lift from the problem of propulsion. And that single conceptual breakthrough is arguably the most important idea in the entire history of aviation. Think about what that means. For thousands of years, people had looked at birds and assumed that wings had to do everything, generate lift and provide thrust simultaneously through flapping. Cayley said no. The wing just sits there and lets the air flow over it. Something else, an engine, a propeller, whatever, pushes the aircraft forward, and the forward motion is what makes the wing work. That's the fundamental architecture of every airplane that has ever flown, from the Wright Flyer to a Boeing 787. The wing generates lift. The engine generates thrust. 2 separate systems working together. Cayley didn't stop there. Over the next several decades, he built and tested gliders. He studied wing shapes. He experimented with cambered airfoils, wings that are curved on top and flatter on the bottom, which we'll talk about in much more detail later, because the shape of a wing is one of the most beautiful pieces of engineering you'll ever encounter. He built a whirling arm apparatus, which is basically a long beam that spins around a central pivot, with a wing shape mounted at the end, so you can measure how much lift and drag different shapes produce at different speeds. It's a crude ancestor of the wind tunnel. And in 1853, when Cayley was 79 years old, he built a full-sized glider and, according to accounts that are somewhat disputed but generally accepted, he convinced his coachman, a man whose name may have been John Appleby, to ride in it as it was launched across a small valley on Cayley's estate. The glider flew. Briefly, unsteadily, but it flew. The coachman reportedly climbed out, shaken, and said something to the effect of, "Sir George, I was hired to drive, not to fly," which is one of the great lines in aviation history. So by the middle of the 19th century, the theoretical foundation was there. Cayley had laid it out. Lift, weight, thrust, drag, fixed wings, separate propulsion, cambered airfoils. But there was still an enormous gap between understanding the principles and actually building a machine that could sustain controlled, powered flight. And filling that gap would take another 50 years of work by a series of brilliant, eccentric, and sometimes tragic figures. One of the most important, and most heartbreaking, was a German engineer named Otto Lilienthal, and his story begins in the rolling hills outside Berlin, where he built himself a conical hill. An artificial hill, actually. He had it built specifically for his experiments, about 15 meters tall, right there in Lichterfelde, which is now a suburb of Berlin. And the reason he built a hill is simple and kind of wonderful. He needed a place where he could launch himself into the wind, no matter which direction it was blowing. So he constructed this cone-shaped mound and would climb to the top, strap himself into one of his gliders, face into the breeze, and run downhill until the air caught him and lifted him off the ground. Picture that for a moment. A man in the 1890s, standing on top of a little hill he built with his own money, wearing what looks like a pair of enormous bat wings made of willow and cotton, waiting for the wind to pick up. And then he runs and he flies. Not far, maybe 50 meters, maybe 100 on a good day, but he flies. And he does it again and again, over 2,000 flights between 1891 and 1896, meticulously recording what he learns each time. Lilienthal was a proper engineer, trained at the Royal Technical Academy in Berlin, and he brought a rigor to flight experimentation that really hadn't existed before. He published a book in 1889 called Bird Flight as the Basis of Aviation. And this book is one of those quietly revolutionary documents that changed the course of history. In it, he compiled detailed tables of lift and drag measurements for different wing shapes at different angles. He'd done years of careful experiments, measuring the forces on curved surfaces, and he presented the data in a way that other experimenters could actually use. Think about what that means. Before Lilienthal, if you wanted to build a flying machine, you were mostly guessing. You might have Cayley's general principles, sure, but you didn't have hard numbers. You didn't know how much lift a wing of a given shape and size would produce at a given speed. Lilienthal gave the world those numbers, or at least his best approximation of them. And those tables would prove enormously influential, even though, as we'll discover later, some of the numbers turned out to be slightly off, which caused real problems for the people who relied on them. But here's what made Lilienthal truly special, and it's something that separates him from almost everyone who came before. He didn't just theorize, he didn't just build models, he flew. He put himself in the machine every single time. He believed, and he said this explicitly, that the only way to learn to fly was to actually fly, to feel the air, to develop the instincts, to understand in your body what the wind was doing to you. He called it the practice of flying, and he compared it to learning to ride a bicycle or swim. You can read all the books you want about swimming, but at some point you have to get in the water. And his gliders were beautiful in their way. They were hang gliders, essentially. He would grip a frame with his hands and hang below the wings, shifting his body weight to control the direction of flight. Lean left to turn left, lean forward to pitch down. It was crude and it was limited, and it meant that control depended entirely on how quickly and how far he could swing his body, which isn't much when you're dangling from a wooden frame in a gusty wind. But it worked well enough for short flights in mild conditions. He got airborne. He stayed airborne. He landed, usually in one piece. And the photographs, someone brought a camera out to that little hill, and the photographs of Lilienthal hanging beneath his glider, silhouetted against the sky, were published in newspapers and magazines around the world. They were sensational. For the first time, people could see with their own eyes that a human being was actually flying, not floating in a balloon, not falling with style, but genuinely gliding through the air on wings. Those photographs inspired an entire generation of would-be aviators. They reached a bicycle mechanic in Dayton, Ohio, and changed his life. But we'll get to him in a little while. The tragedy of Otto Lilienthal is that his method of control, body shifting, simply wasn't adequate for the challenge of sustained flight. On August 9, 1896, during a routine glide from a hill near Rhino, a gust of wind pitched his glider nose up. It stalled, meaning the angle of the wing became too steep for the air to flow smoothly over it, and the lift just collapsed. He fell from a height of about 15 meters. He broke his spine. He died the next day in a Berlin hospital. He was 48 years old. His last words, according to his brother Gustav, were "Sacrifices must be made. Opfer müssen gebracht werden." And that line carries so much weight because Lilienthal knew the risks. He'd always known the risks. He flew anyway, because he believed that the knowledge gained from each flight was worth the danger, and that someone, eventually, would take what he'd learned and solve the remaining problems. He was right about that, but the cost was his life. Now, let's pause here for a moment and talk about something that Lilienthal's story brings into sharp focus, because it's one of the central engineering challenges of flight. And it's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention when people talk about the history of aviation. Everyone focuses on lift. How do you get a machine into the air? And that's important, obviously. But the problem that killed Lilienthal, and that would bedevil every early aviator, wasn't lift. It was control. How do you steer? How do you keep the machine stable when the air is doing unpredictable things? How do you recover when a gust tips you sideways or pushes your nose up? Think about it this way. Imagine you're standing on a surfboard in the ocean, getting up on the board. That's the lift problem. That's hard enough. But staying up, adjusting to every wave, every shift in the current, keeping your balance when the water does something unexpected, that's the control problem. And in some ways, it's harder because it never stops. You have to solve it continuously, every second you're in the air. An airplane moves in 3 dimensions, and it can rotate around 3 different axes. Let's walk through them, because this is fundamental to understanding how flight works. And it's one of those things that seems complicated at first, but becomes beautifully intuitive once you see it. First, there's pitch. Pitch is the nose going up or down. Imagine a seesaw. When one end goes up, the other goes down. An airplane pitches when its nose tilts upward toward the sky or downward toward the ground. This is controlled, in a modern airplane, by the elevator, a movable surface on the horizontal tail at the back of the plane. When the pilot pulls back on the control column, the elevator deflects upward, which pushes the tail down and the nose up. When they push forward, the opposite happens. Simple enough, right? Second, there's roll. Roll is the airplane tilting sideways. One wing goes up, the other goes down. Think of it like tilting your head to touch your ear to your shoulder. Roll is controlled by ailerons, which are movable surfaces on the trailing edge of each wing, near the tips. Here's the clever part. They work in opposite directions. When the left aileron goes up, the right aileron goes down. The wing with the lowered aileron generates more lift, so it rises. The wing with the raised aileron generates less lift, so it drops. The airplane rolls toward the side with less lift. And roll is how you actually turn an airplane. You don't just swing the nose sideways like steering a car. You bank into the turn, tilting the lift vector so that a component of it pulls you around the curve. It's like leaning into a turn on a bicycle. Third, there's yaw. Yaw is the nose swinging left or right, like a weather vane turning in the wind. This is controlled by the rudder, which is a movable surface on the vertical tail fin. The rudder is used more for coordination and correction than for primary turning. It keeps the airplane pointed in the direction it's actually moving, prevents it from skidding sideways through the air. Pitch, roll, and yaw. 3 axes, 3 types of rotation, 3 sets of control surfaces. And here's the thing. In the 1890s, nobody had figured all of this out yet. Lilienthal had pitch control, sort of, through body shifting. He had a little bit of roll control, also through body shifting. But he had essentially no yaw control, and his ability to manage any of these axes was limited by how far and how fast he could swing his body weight. When the air did something sudden and violent, he simply couldn't respond quickly enough. Other experimenters were working on the same problems, with varying degrees of success. In America, an engineer and inventor named Octave Chanute, originally French, but he'd emigrated to the United States and made his name building bridges and railroads, became a kind of clearinghouse for aviation knowledge. Chanute was in his 60s by the 1890s, wealthy and well-connected, and he corresponded with practically everyone in the world who was working on flight. He collected information, shared it freely, and encouraged collaboration. He also built and tested his own gliders on the sand dunes along the southern shore of Lake Michigan, near what's now the Indiana Dunes. His most successful design, the two-surface glider of 1896, used a biplane configuration, 2 wings stacked one above the other, braced with wires, that was remarkably stable and became the template for almost every airplane built in the following decade. Chanute didn't solve the control problem either, but he did something almost as important. He kept the community of experimenters connected. He wrote letters, he gave lectures, he published articles, and one day, in 1899, he received a letter from a young man in Dayton, Ohio, who had read about Lilienthal's flights and Lilienthal's death, and who had become consumed by the idea that the control problem was the key to everything. The young man's name was Wilbur Wright, and the letter he wrote to the Smithsonian Institution. Actually, the first letter went to the Smithsonian, asking for everything they had on aeronautics, and then he began corresponding with Chanute. That letter set in motion a chain of events that would, within 4 years, produce the first successful, powered, controlled, heavier-than-air flight in human history. But what's fascinating about Wilbur Wright and his brother Orville is how they approached the problem. Because they didn't start where everyone else started. They didn't start with lift. They didn't start with engines. They started with control. They looked at Lilienthal's death and they said, essentially, the problem isn't getting into the air. Birds solved that millions of years ago. The problem is staying in the air and going where you want to go. And until you solve control, nothing else matters. Building a more powerful engine for an uncontrollable airplane just means you'll crash faster and from higher up. And this insight, this reframing of the entire problem, is what made the Wright brothers different from every other experimenter of their era. They were bicycle mechanics from Ohio with no university education, no government funding, no wealthy patrons. What they had was an extraordinary ability to think clearly about complex problems, a willingness to question assumptions that everyone else took for granted, and a workshop full of tools they knew how to use. And they had each other, 2 minds that worked in a kind of creative friction, arguing constantly, testing each other's ideas, pushing toward solutions that neither might have reached alone. The story of how they solved the control problem begins with an observation about birds. Wilbur had been watching birds, buzzards specifically, soaring in the wind near Dayton, and he noticed something. When a gust tipped a bird to one side, the bird didn't just shift its weight like Lilienthal would have. It twisted its wings. One wingtip would angle slightly upward, and the other would angle slightly downward, and this differential twist would restore the bird's balance almost instantly. The bird was changing the shape of its wings in flight, creating more lift on one side and less on the other, and using that asymmetry to roll back to level. Wilbur's genius was recognizing that you could do the same thing with a mechanical wing, and the way he figured out how to do it is one of the great stories in engineering. It involves a cardboard box, of all things. He was standing in the bicycle shop one day, fiddling with a long, narrow cardboard box, the kind that an inner tube might come in, and he noticed that if he gripped the ends and twisted, the box would warp. One end would tilt one way, and the other end would tilt the opposite way. And he realized that you could do exactly this to a biplane wing. If you connected the upper and lower wings with flexible joints and attached cables, you could twist the entire wing structure so that one side had a greater angle and the other side had a lesser angle. More lift on one side, less on the other. Controlled roll. They called it wing warping, and it was the breakthrough that changed everything. It was the missing piece that nobody else in the world had figured out. Not Langley with his government funding, not Chanute with his decades of experience, not any of the European experimenters who were chasing the same dream. Two bicycle mechanics in Dayton, Ohio, cracked the fundamental problem of controlled flight because one of them was fidgeting with a cardboard box. And here's what's really important to understand about wing warping. It wasn't just a clever trick. It was a philosophy. The Wrights understood something profound, that an airplane shouldn't be inherently stable. That might sound counterintuitive, right? You'd think you'd want an airplane to be as stable as possible, to naturally resist any disturbance and return to level flight on its own. And that's exactly what most of their competitors were trying to build. Langley, Chanute, nearly everyone else was designing machines that would fly themselves, essentially. Aircraft that were so stable they'd resist being tipped or turned by the wind. The pilot was almost a passenger. But the Wrights looked at that approach and said no. They wanted an airplane that was inherently unstable, one that the pilot actively controlled at all times, the way you actively balance a bicycle. And, of course, they would think that way. They were bicycle builders. They understood intuitively that a bicycle is unstable. It falls over if you don't balance it. But that instability is exactly what makes it maneuverable. You lean into a turn, you shift your weight, you make constant, tiny corrections, and that's what gives you control. A tricycle is stable. A bicycle is controllable. The Wrights wanted to build a bicycle for the sky. So wing warping gave them roll control. But they knew from the beginning that roll alone wasn't enough. You need all three axes. You need pitch control to point the nose up or down, and you need yaw control to point the nose left or right. For pitch, they made a decision that was unusual at the time. They put the elevator in front of the wings, not behind them. This forward elevator, sometimes called a canard, was their pitch control surface. They chose this configuration partly because they believed a forward elevator would help prevent the kind of nose-down dive that had killed Lilienthal. If the machine started to pitch down, the forward elevator would hit the increased airflow first and push the nose back up, acting as a kind of early warning system. It wasn't a perfect theory, and later aircraft would move the elevator to the back where it works more effectively, but for the Wrights' purposes, it was a reasonable choice. And it worked. Now yaw, turning left and right, that came later. And it came because they discovered a problem they hadn't anticipated. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's talk about what they actually did with all these ideas, because the Wrights didn't just sit in their shop theorizing. They built things. They tested things. They went to the wind. In September of 1900, Wilbur traveled to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They'd chosen this spot very deliberately. They wrote to the United States Weather Bureau asking for locations with strong, steady winds and soft, sandy terrain for crash landings. Kitty Hawk on the Outer Banks fit perfectly. Consistent winds averaging around 13 miles per hour, wide-open sand flats, and relative privacy. That last part mattered to them. They didn't want spectators. They didn't want press. They wanted to work. That first year, they brought a glider, no engine, just a biplane glider with about 17 feet of wingspan and the wing warping system built in. And honestly, the results were disappointing. The glider didn't produce nearly as much lift as they'd predicted. They'd calculated the expected lift using Lilienthal's data tables. Remember those tables from his years of careful measurements? The Wrights had relied on them heavily, and the numbers just weren't adding up. The glider was generating maybe a third to a half of the lift that Lilienthal's data said it should. They flew it mostly as a kite that first season, with ropes controlling it from the ground, and they got some useful experience with the wing warping, but the lift problem was troubling. They came back in 1901 with a bigger glider, 22 feet of wingspan this time, and the results were even more frustrating. More wing area should have meant proportionally more lift, but the performance was still way below predictions, and worse, they encountered a new problem. When they warped the wings to initiate a roll, something strange happened. The wing that went up, the one with increased lift, would sometimes drag backward, and the whole glider would swing around and dive toward the ground on the high wing side. They called it well digging, because the wingtip would dig into the sand. It was dangerous, and they didn't fully understand why it was happening. Wilbur came home from that 1901 season genuinely discouraged. He reportedly told Orville that man would not fly in 1,000 years. Think about that. The person who would achieve powered flight in just over 2 years was ready to give up. And what pulled them back was stubbornness, really. That, and a growing suspicion that the problem wasn't their design. The problem was the data. Here's where the Wrights did something that separates great engineers from good ones. Instead of just tweaking their glider and trying again, they went back to first principles. They questioned everything, including the numbers that everyone in the field had been treating as gospel. Lilienthal's lift tables, Smeaton's coefficient, a number used in the lift equation that dated back to the 18th century. The Wrights decided to check these numbers for themselves. So in the fall of 1901, back in Dayton, they built a wind tunnel. Now, wind tunnels weren't new. Francis Wenham had built one back in 1871. But the Wrights' wind tunnel was a masterpiece of practical engineering. It was a simple wooden box, about 6 feet long and 16 inches square, with a fan driven by a small gasoline engine at one end. What made it brilliant was the measuring instruments inside. They built delicate balances out of bicycle spokes and hacksaw blades, little devices that could compare the lift and drag of different wing shapes simultaneously, canceling out variations in wind speed. The elegance of these instruments is still admired by aerodynamicists today. They were cheap, they were homemade, and they were remarkably accurate. Over the course of about 2 months, October and November of 1901, the Wrights tested over 200 different wing shapes in that wind tunnel. Miniature airfoils made of sheet metal, each one slightly different, different cambers, different aspect ratios, different thicknesses, different edge shapes. They tested monoplanes and biplanes and triplanes. They tested wings that were long and narrow versus wings that were short and wide, and what they found confirmed their suspicion. Lilienthal's data was off. Not by a little, by a lot. And more importantly, Smeaton's coefficient, the number that everyone had been plugging into the lift equation for over 100 years, was wrong. The accepted value was about 0.005. The Wrights determined it was closer to 0.0033. That's a 30% error, and it explained perfectly why their gliders had been underperforming. Let's pause on this for a second, because it's genuinely remarkable. Two men with no college education, no formal training in physics or engineering, working in a bicycle shop in Ohio, had just overturned a century of accepted aerodynamic data. They did it with homemade instruments on a shoestring budget in 2 months. And they were right. Their wind tunnel data was so good that when they used it to design their next glider, the 1902 model, the predicted performance matched the actual performance almost exactly. That almost never happens in engineering, and it tells you just how careful and precise their measurements were. The 1902 glider was a revelation. It had a 32-foot wingspan, a much better airfoil shape based on their wind tunnel results, and it flew beautifully. Lift was right where they predicted. But that well-digging problem, the one where the high wing would drag and the glider would spin, was still there. And this is where the third axis of control finally enters the story. They'd initially put a fixed vertical fin at the tail, thinking it would counteract the tendency to yaw during wing warping. The idea was that when the glider started to swing sideways, the fixed fin would catch the airflow and straighten things out like a weather vane. But it didn't work. In fact, it sometimes made things worse. Here's why. And this is a beautiful piece of aerodynamic reasoning. When you warp the wings to roll, the wing that goes up generates more lift. But more lift also means more drag. It's called induced drag, and it's an unavoidable consequence of producing lift. So the high wing is producing more drag than the low wing, and that differential drag is pulling the nose toward the high wing side. The fixed vertical fin, instead of correcting this, was actually adding to the problem. The sideways airflow was hitting the fin and pushing the tail even further around. Orville had the insight, reportedly coming to him one night as he lay awake thinking about it. What if the vertical fin wasn't fixed? What if it could move? If you made it a movable rudder, and you coordinated it with the wing warping so that when you warped the wings, the rudder would deflect to counteract the adverse yaw, well, then you'd have it. All three axes, working together. Roll from wing warping, pitch from the forward elevator, yaw from the movable rudder. Complete control. They connected the rudder cables to the wing warping system so that the pilot could operate both simultaneously with a single hip cradle. The pilot would lie prone on the lower wing, and shifting their hips to one side would simultaneously warp the wings and deflect the rudder in a coordinated way. It was ingenious, and it worked. In October of 1902, they made hundreds of glides, over 1,000 that season, some covering distances of over 600 feet. They could turn, they could bank, they could correct for gusts. They had solved the control problem. And now, only now, were they ready to add an engine. This is something people often get backwards. They think the Wright brothers' achievement was building a flying machine with a motor. But the motor was almost an afterthought. The real work, the years of patient experimentation, the wind tunnel, the glider testing, all of that was about control. The engine was just the final ingredient in a recipe they'd been perfecting for 4 years. But adding an engine brought its own set of problems, and the biggest one was something you might not expect. It wasn't the engine itself. They actually designed and built a perfectly adequate 4-cylinder gasoline engine with their mechanic Charlie Taylor in just 6 weeks. An impressive feat, but not their hardest challenge. The real problem was the propellers. And this is where the Wrights made yet another contribution that doesn't get nearly enough recognition. They realized something that nobody else had grasped, that a propeller is not a screw pushing through the air the way a boat propeller pushes through water. A propeller is a rotating wing. Each blade is an airfoil, and it generates lift. Except that lift is directed forward, and we call it thrust. Once they understood that, they could apply everything they'd learned about wing design to propeller design. They could use their wind tunnel data, their understanding of camber and angle of attack, to design propellers from first principles. And the propellers they built for the 1903 Flyer were astonishingly efficient, about 66%, which is remarkable when you consider that modern propellers, designed with computers and over a century of additional knowledge, typically achieve around 85 to 90%. The Wrights got 2/3 of the way to modern efficiency on their first try, working from pure theory and handmade wind tunnel models. That's not tinkering. That's applied physics at a level that would have impressed any university professor of the day. And they were bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, who never finished high school. So by December of 1903, they had everything. They had wings they understood. They had 3-axis control, pitch through the forward elevator, roll through wing warping, yaw through the movable rear rudder, all coordinated. They had an engine light enough and powerful enough. They had propellers designed from airfoil theory. And they had a launch system, a 60-foot wooden rail laid along the sand at Kitty Hawk with a small wheeled dolly that the Flyer sat on. No wheels on the aircraft itself, just wooden skids for landing. The whole thing weighed about 605 pounds without a pilot, and with Orville aboard for the first attempt, maybe 750 total. December 17th, 1903. Cold, windy, about 27 miles per hour out of the north, which was actually stronger than they wanted. But they'd been waiting for days, and they were running out of season. They'd already had a failed attempt on December 14th, when Wilbur won a coin toss for who'd go first, and he overcontrolled on takeoff and stalled into the sand after 3.5 seconds. Minor damage, 2 days of repairs. So on the 17th, it was Orville's turn. And here's what I want you to picture. 5 men from the local life-saving station are standing around as witnesses. It's freezing. The brothers shake hands, and several accounts say it was a longer handshake than usual, like they both understood the significance of the moment, or maybe they were just cold and nervous. The engine is running, the propellers are spinning, and Orville lies down on the lower wing, hip in the cradle that controls the wing warping. He releases the restraining wire, and the Flyer starts moving down the rail into that headwind. 12 seconds, 120 feet. That was the first flight, barely longer than the wingspan of a modern 737. Wilbur was running alongside, and he'd been holding the right wingtip to keep it balanced during the ground roll, and then suddenly there was nothing to hold because the machine was in the air, and the famous photograph, you've probably seen it, captures exactly that moment. Wilbur standing, the Flyer just airborne, Orville prone at the controls. John T. Daniels, one of the life-saving station crew who'd never operated a camera before, squeezed the shutter at precisely the right instant. One of the most important photographs in human history, taken by a man who didn't really know how to use a camera. They flew 3 more times that day. The second and third flights went a bit farther, and then on the 4th flight, Wilbur covered 852 feet in 59 seconds. That's the one. That's the flight that really demonstrated sustained, controlled, powered, heavier-than-air flight. 59 seconds of a human being piloting a machine through the air, turning, adjusting, managing the wind. And then a gust caught the flyer after it landed, tumbled it across the sand, and damaged it beyond quick repair. They never flew the 1903 flyer again. And almost nobody noticed. That's the part that always gets me. They sent a telegram to their father, Milton, back in Dayton. The local newspaper garbled the story. A few outlets picked it up, got the details wrong, and most people simply didn't believe it. For years, the Wright brothers continued developing their aircraft almost in obscurity. They went back to Dayton, built a better flyer, practiced at Huffman Prairie, a cow pasture outside of town, and by 1905, they had the Wright Flyer 3, which could fly for over half an hour, make banked turns, fly figure eights. It was a practical airplane. And still, almost nobody was paying attention. Part of this was their own fault. They were secretive, terrified of having their ideas stolen before they could secure patents. They stopped flying publicly for over 2 years, while they tried to sell the airplane to the U.S. Army and various European governments. And during those years, other people were catching up. In France, Brazil, across Europe, aviators were making their own attempts, some of them not even aware of what the Wrights had accomplished. But here's what I really want to talk about now, because this is where the story of how airplanes work shifts from the story of invention to the story of engineering evolution. The Wright brothers solved the fundamental problem. They proved that controlled, powered flight was possible, and they showed one way to do it. But their way, their specific design, had limitations that would become apparent pretty quickly, and the next decade would see an explosion of innovation that transformed their fragile, finicky contraption into something that actually started to resemble the airplanes we know today. Let's talk about what changed and why. The Wright Flyer was a canard design. The elevator was out front, ahead of the wings. Remember, they put it there so the pilot could see it move, so they could get direct visual feedback on what the control surface was doing. That made sense for learning to fly. But a canard configuration has some tricky characteristics. One issue is that the front elevator is operating in clean, undisturbed air, while the main wings behind it are flying through air that the canard has already deflected. This creates complex interactions. More importantly, having the elevator in front can make the aircraft more sensitive in pitch, easier to accidentally over-control, which is exactly what happened to Wilbur on that first failed attempt on December 14th. Most designers who came after the Wrights moved the elevator to the back of the aircraft, behind the tail. This is the conventional configuration you see on almost every airplane today. The main wings up front, and the horizontal stabilizer with its elevator at the tail. And there's a beautiful reason why this works so well. Think about an arrow. An arrow flies straight because the feathers at the back create drag behind the center of gravity. If the arrow starts to turn, the feathers catch the air and push it back into line. A tail-mounted horizontal stabilizer does something similar for an airplane. If the nose pitches up unexpectedly, the tail surfaces generate a restoring force that pushes it back down. The airplane is naturally stable in pitch. It wants to return to its trimmed attitude. Now the Wrights would have argued, and they did argue, that inherent stability was a crutch, that a pilot should be actively controlling the aircraft at all times, the way you balance a bicycle. And for the early days, when flights were short and the pilot's full attention was on just keeping the thing in the air, that philosophy worked. But as flights got longer, as airplanes started carrying passengers, as pilots needed to navigate and communicate and do things other than just fly, inherent stability became essential. You can't fly for 6 hours with your hands constantly correcting every tiny disturbance. You need an airplane that, if you let go of the controls for a moment, keeps flying more or less straight and level on its own. So the shift from canard to conventional tail configuration wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a fundamental change in design philosophy, from the Wright's idea of an inherently unstable aircraft controlled by a skilled pilot to an inherently stable aircraft that the pilot directs but doesn't have to constantly wrestle. And that shift happened remarkably fast. By 1910 or so, almost everyone had abandoned the canard layout. The other big change was the move from wing warping to ailerons. Wing warping worked. The Wrights proved that. But it had real drawbacks. Twisting the entire wing structure puts enormous stress on the airframe. As airplanes got faster and wings got stiffer and stronger, warping them became mechanically difficult and structurally dangerous. You're asking the whole wing to flex, and that flexing weakens the structure over time. Ailerons are a much cleaner solution. Instead of twisting the whole wing, you hinge a small panel on the trailing edge of each wing, near the tip. When you want to roll right, the left aileron deflects downward, increasing the camber and lift on the left wing, while the right aileron deflects upward, decreasing lift on the right wing. The left wing rises, the right wing drops, and the airplane rolls to the right. Same result as wing warping, but achieved by moving small, lightweight control surfaces instead of deforming the entire wing structure. The concept of ailerons actually predated the Wrights. A British inventor named Matthew Piers Watt Boulton patented the idea back in 1868, decades before anyone could build an airplane to put them on. And several early aviators, including Glenn Curtiss in America and Henri Farman in France, adopted ailerons early on. This led to one of the most bitter patent disputes in aviation history because the Wright brothers held a patent on their wing warping system, and they argued that ailerons were just another way of achieving the same thing, controlling roll by varying lift across the wingspan, and therefore infringed on their patent. The patent wars consumed years of the Wrights' energy and attention. Wilbur in particular threw himself into the legal battles, traveling constantly, testifying, strategizing. Some historians believe the stress contributed to his early death from typhoid fever in 1912 at just 45 years old. Think about that. The man who solved the problem of flight, who stood on that freezing beach and ran alongside the first airplane, spent his last years not in a workshop or a cockpit, but in courtrooms. It's one of the saddest threads in the whole story of aviation. But while the patent wars raged, the technology kept advancing. And now I want to shift our attention to something we haven't really talked about yet, something that was becoming increasingly important as airplanes got faster and heavier. We've talked about lift and we've talked about control. But there's a force we mentioned way back at the beginning and then somewhat set aside. And it's time to bring it back, because it's about to become the central obsession of aircraft designers for the next century. Drag. You remember the 4 forces: lift, weight, thrust, and drag. Drag is the air's resistance to the airplane moving through it, and it comes in several different flavors. And understanding those flavors is one of the keys to understanding why airplanes look the way they do. The simplest kind is called parasitic drag, or sometimes form drag. This is just the air pushing back against the shape of the airplane. Stick your hand out a car window, palm facing forward. and you feel the wind pushing your hand back. That's parasitic drag. It depends on the shape of the object and how big it is, the cross-sectional area that's facing into the wind. A flat plate creates a lot of parasitic drag. A teardrop shape, rounded at the front and tapering smoothly to a point at the back, creates much less because the air can flow around it smoothly without separating into turbulent eddies. That smooth flow is called streamlined flow or laminar flow, and achieving it became an obsession. Early airplanes were not remotely streamlined. They were tangles of wires and struts and exposed engines and landing gear, and the pilot sitting out in the open wind. Every wire, every strut, every surface that the wind hit created drag. And here's the thing about parasitic drag that makes it so important. It increases with the square of your speed. Double your speed, and you get 4 times the drag. Triple your speed, 9 times the drag. So as engine technology improved and airplanes started going faster, drag became a bigger and bigger problem. At the low speeds the Wrights flew, maybe 30 miles per hour, drag was manageable. But push toward 100 miles per hour, 200, 300, and suddenly drag is eating up almost all of your engine's power. Then there's the other major type of drag, and this one is sneakier. It's called induced drag, and it's actually a direct consequence of generating lift. Remember how a wing works: higher pressure below, lower pressure above. Well, at the wingtips, that high-pressure air underneath curls around the tip and spills over into the low-pressure region on top. This creates swirling vortices trailing behind each wingtip. You've maybe seen them on humid days, those beautiful spiraling contrails streaming off the wings of a landing airplane. Those vortices are visible evidence of energy being wasted. The air is being set into rotation, and that rotational energy comes from somewhere. It comes from the airplane's forward motion, which means it acts as drag. Induced drag is fascinating because it behaves opposite to parasitic drag. Induced drag is highest when the airplane is flying slowly at a high angle of attack, generating lots of lift relative to its speed. As you go faster, induced drag decreases. So you've got parasitic drag increasing with speed and induced drag decreasing with speed. And if you plot them both on a graph, they form a pair of curves that cross, and the total drag has a minimum point somewhere in the middle. That minimum drag speed is, roughly speaking, the most efficient speed for the airplane to fly at, the speed where it gets the most distance per unit of fuel. Airlines care about this a lot. And the shape of the wing itself plays a huge role in how much induced drag you get. This is where a concept called aspect ratio comes in. And it's one of those ideas that once you understand it, you start noticing it everywhere. Aspect ratio is simply the wingspan divided by the average chord, the chord being the distance from the leading edge to the trailing edge of the wing. A long, narrow wing has a high aspect ratio. A short, stubby wing has a low aspect ratio. High aspect ratio wings produce less induced drag, and the reason goes back to those wingtip vortices. On a long, narrow wing, most of the wing's span is far from the tips, so most of the wing is generating lift efficiently, away from the disruptive tip effects. On a short, stubby wing, the tips make up a larger proportion of the total span, so more of the wing is affected by that energy-wasting spillover. This is why gliders, aircraft that have no engine and need to extract every possible bit of efficiency from the air, have extremely long, narrow wings. A competition glider might have an aspect ratio of 30 or more, and it's why albatrosses, the most efficient long-distance flyers in nature, have those enormous wingspans relative to their wing width. Evolution figured out aspect ratio millions of years before engineers did. But you can't just make wings infinitely long and narrow. Structural weight goes up. A very long wing needs a very strong spar to keep it from bending or breaking, especially in turbulence, and that strong spar is heavy. There's always a trade-off. And for airplanes that need to be maneuverable, fighter jets, aerobatic planes, a lower aspect ratio actually has advantages because shorter wings are stiffer, lighter, and can roll faster. So the aspect ratio you choose depends entirely on what you want the airplane to do, and that brings us to something that was becoming painfully clear in the years just before the First World War, when airplane design was no longer a hobby for eccentric inventors tinkering in bicycle shops. It was becoming a military question, and military questions come with military budgets, and military budgets change everything. By around 1910, 1911, governments across Europe were watching what had been a novelty, these rickety wire-braced contraptions puttering over fairgrounds, and starting to think very seriously about what an airplane could do in a war. Italy actually used airplanes in combat first, during the Italo-Turkish War of 1911, mostly for reconnaissance, just flying over enemy positions and looking down. And that alone was enough to make every general staff in Europe sit up and pay attention, because reconnaissance had always been the hardest problem in warfare. You never really knew what was on the other side of that hill. Suddenly, you could just fly over and look. The implications were enormous, and the money started flowing, and when the money flows, engineering accelerates. So what happened in the few years between about 1909 and 1914 is this rapid, almost frantic evolution of airplane design, driven by the simple fact that governments wanted airplanes that could fly faster, higher, farther, and carry more weight. And every one of those demands runs straight into the aerodynamic trade-offs we've been talking about. You want to go faster? You need to reduce drag. You want to carry more weight? You need more lift, which means more wing area or higher speeds or better airfoils. But more wing area means more drag, and higher speeds mean more drag. And now you're back to needing a more powerful engine, which is heavier, which means you need even more lift. It's this beautiful, maddening loop, and the engineers of that era were figuring it out in real time, often by building something, watching it fail, and trying again. One of the most important transitions in this period was the move from biplanes to, well, actually, they didn't move away from biplanes. Not yet. And there's a really interesting structural reason for that. Remember, the problem with a long, high aspect ratio wing is that it needs to be strong enough not to break. And in 1910, the materials available were wood and fabric and wire. That's it. No aluminum, no carbon fiber, no high-strength steel alloys in the wing structure. Just spruce and cotton or linen stretched over it, and piano wire for bracing. So how do you make a wing strong enough? You use two wings, one above the other, connected by struts and braced with wires, and the whole thing becomes a truss, a three-dimensional structural framework where the wires carry tension and the struts carry compression, and together they resist bending and twisting far better than a single wing of the same span could manage on its own. Think of it like a bookshelf. A single long shelf will sag in the middle under heavy books. But if you put a second shelf above it and connect them with vertical supports, and then run diagonal braces between the two, suddenly the whole thing is rigid. That's what a biplane wing structure is doing. The two wings plus the struts and wires form a deep beam, and a deeper beam is stiffer and stronger than a shallow one. So for the materials available at the time, The biplane configuration was actually the smart engineering choice. It let you have a reasonable wingspan without the wing folding up on you in flight. The cost, of course, was drag. All those struts and wires sticking into the airflow, creating enormous amounts of parasitic drag. Every wire is a tiny cylinder in the wind, and cylinders are aerodynamically terrible shapes. The drag from the bracing wires alone on a World War I biplane could account for a shocking percentage of the total drag. Some estimates put it at 30% or more. So here's the tension that defined aircraft design for the next 2 decades. Everyone knew, theoretically, that a clean monoplane, a single-wing airplane with no external bracing, would be more aerodynamically efficient, less drag, faster speeds, better fuel economy. But nobody could build one strong enough because the materials weren't there yet. The structural technology lagged behind the aerodynamic understanding, and that gap is one of the most important stories in aviation engineering. Closing that gap is essentially the story of the 1920s and 1930s. But before we get there, let's stay with the First World War for a moment, because the war did something remarkable to aviation. In 1914, when the war began, airplanes were slow, fragile, and barely useful. By 1918, just 4 years later, they were fast, reasonably reliable, specialized machines, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, even torpedo planes. The pace of development was staggering, driven by the brutal logic of combat. If the other side has a faster airplane, your pilots die. That's a powerful motivator. And this is where engine development becomes absolutely central to the story, because the airframe, the structure and shape of the airplane, can only do so much. At some point, you need more power. The early Wright engines produced about 12 horsepower. By the end of the First World War, engines like the Liberty L-12, an American design, were producing over 400 horsepower. That's a 30-fold increase in about 15 years. And it wasn't just horsepower, it was power-to-weight ratio. The Liberty engine produced roughly 400 horsepower and weighed about 800 pounds. That's about 2 pounds per horsepower. The Wright brothers' engine had been closer to 15 pounds per horsepower. That improvement in power-to-weight ratio is what made faster, heavier, more capable airplanes possible. Now, here's where the engine story connects back to aerodynamics in a really elegant way. As engines got more powerful and airplanes got faster, the relative importance of different types of drag shifted. At low speeds, induced drag dominates. That's the drag from generating lift, the wingtip vortex problem. At high speeds, parasitic drag dominates. That's the drag from the shape of the airplane pushing through the air. So as airplanes got faster through the war years and into the 1920s, parasitic drag became the bigger enemy, and suddenly all those struts and wires on biplanes went from being a minor nuisance to being the main thing holding you back. This is what drove the push toward streamlining. And streamlining isn't just about making things pointy at the front, though that helps. It's about understanding what actually causes parasitic drag, and there are really 2 components. There's form drag, which is about the shape of the object. A flat plate has enormous form drag. A teardrop shape has very little, because the teardrop lets the air close smoothly behind it, instead of creating a turbulent wake. And there's skin friction drag, which is literally the friction of air molecules rubbing against the surface of the airplane. Form drag depends on shape. Skin friction drag depends on surface area and surface roughness. A biplane with 2 wings, all those struts, all those wires, exposed landing gear, the pilot sitting out in the open. It has terrible form drag and a lot of surface area for skin friction. a clean monoplane with an enclosed cockpit and retractable landing gear, addresses both problems at once. The Schneider Trophy races of the 1920s and early 1930s were where a lot of this streamlining knowledge was developed, and they're a wonderful story. Jacques Schneider was a French financier and aviation enthusiast who established a trophy in 1911 for seaplane speed races, and over the next 2 decades, these races became the Formula One of aviation, intensely competitive, lavishly funded, and pushing technology to its absolute limits. The winning speeds tell the story. In 1913, the winner averaged about 45 miles per hour. By 1931, the Supermarine S-6B, designed by R.J. Mitchell, remember that name, won at an average speed of over 340 miles per hour. That's a nearly 8-fold increase in 18 years. And the S-6B looked nothing like a World War I biplane. It was a low-wing monoplane with a beautifully streamlined fuselage, the engine cowled tightly, every surface smooth and faired. The floats were even streamlined. Mitchell and his team at Supermarine had learned, race by race, how to reduce drag, and the lessons they learned went directly into the design of the Spitfire, which Mitchell began designing a few years later. The Spitfire, one of the most famous and effective fighter aircraft of the Second World War, was essentially a Schneider trophy racer adapted for combat. The thin, elliptical wing of the Spitfire, which gave it such beautiful handling characteristics, was designed to minimize both induced drag and wave drag at high speeds, and Mitchell's understanding of those principles came from years of chasing speed records over the water. But Mitchell's story has a bittersweet edge. He was diagnosed with cancer in 1933, had surgery, was told to rest, and instead threw himself into the Spitfire design with even greater intensity, as if he knew he was running out of time. He died in 1937 at the age of 42, a year after the Spitfire's first flight, but before it ever entered service. He never saw what his airplane would do in the Battle of Britain, never knew that it would become a symbol of survival for an entire nation. Sometimes the engineer doesn't get to see the full consequence of their work, and that's one of the quietly heartbreaking things about this field. Now, coming back to that structural problem, the gap between knowing what shape an airplane should be and being able to actually build it, the key breakthrough was metal construction, specifically the development of stressed skin construction using aluminum alloys. And this is one of those transitions that changed absolutely everything. In a traditional wooden fabric airplane, the skin, the fabric covering, carries almost no structural load. It's just there to create the aerodynamic shape. All the loads are carried by the internal framework, the spars, the ribs, the longerons, the bracing wires. The skin is essentially decorative, structurally speaking. But in a stressed skin metal airplane, the outer skin itself becomes a structural member. The aluminum sheet that forms the outside of the wing or fuselage is riveted to the internal framework, and it carries a significant portion of the bending and torsion loads. This means you can eliminate most or all of the external bracing. No more struts, no more wires, because the skin is doing that job. And because you've eliminated all that external bracing, your drag drops dramatically. The person most associated with this revolution is Hugo Junkers, a German professor and engineer who was, frankly, ahead of his time in ways that must have been deeply frustrating for him. Junkers patented an all-metal cantilever monoplane wing, cantilever meaning no external bracing, as early as 1910. He built his first all-metal airplane, the Junkers J-1, in 1915, using sheet steel because suitable aluminum alloys weren't quite available yet. It was nicknamed the Blechesel, the Tin Donkey, and it flew, proving the concept, though it was heavy. By the early 1920s, Junkers had moved to corrugated duralumin. Duralumin being an aluminum-copper alloy that was much lighter than steel but surprisingly strong. And his designs, like the Junkers F-13 of 1919, were genuinely revolutionary. The F-13 was an all-metal, low-wing cantilever monoplane with an enclosed cabin for 4 passengers. In 1919. Most of the aviation world was still building biplanes out of wood and fabric, and here was Junkers with something that looked like it belonged in the 1930s. The corrugated skin was a clever compromise. The corrugations added stiffness to the thin metal sheet, like how corrugated cardboard is stiffer than flat cardboard. But it also added drag because those ridges on the surface disrupted smooth airflow. The next step was figuring out how to use smooth, flat aluminum skin and still get enough stiffness, and that's where the concept of the semi-monocoque structure comes in. And this is genuinely one of the most elegant ideas in all of structural engineering. Picture a tube, like a soda can. A soda can is incredibly light, just a thin shell of aluminum, but it can support a surprising amount of weight if you press straight down on it. That's because the cylindrical shell distributes the load around its entire circumference. A monocoque structure works on this same principle. The outer shell carries the primary loads, but a pure monocoque is vulnerable to local damage. Dent a soda can, and it collapses. So aircraft engineers developed the semi-monocoque, where you have that load-carrying skin, but you also have internal stiffeners, longitudinal stringers running the length of the fuselage, and circumferential frames or formers at regular intervals. And together, the skin and the stiffeners share the load. If the skin gets a small dent or crack, the stringers and frames keep carrying load and prevent the damage from spreading catastrophically. It's a beautifully redundant system, and if you've ever looked into the cargo hold of a commercial airplane and seen that ribbed skeletal interior structure with smooth aluminum skin riveted over it, that's exactly what you were looking at. A semi-monocoque fuselage, and the basic concept hasn't changed much since it was refined in the late 1920s and 1930s. The airplane that probably did more than any other to bring all of these ideas together into one package: metal stressed skin construction, retractable landing gear, an enclosed cockpit, a low-wing cantilever monoplane layout, variable pitch propellers, was the Boeing 247, which first flew in 1933. And right on its heels, improving on almost every aspect of the design, came the Douglas DC-2 in 1934, and then the legendary DC-3 in 1935. The DC-3 is one of those airplanes that deserves its own long conversation because it essentially created commercial aviation as we know it. Before the DC-3, airlines couldn't make money carrying passengers alone. They depended on airmail contracts to survive. The DC-3 was efficient enough, carried enough passengers, 21 in a typical configuration, and was reliable enough that for the first time, an airline could actually turn a profit just by selling tickets. And the engineering reasons it could do this all trace back to everything we've been talking about. Low drag from the clean monoplane configuration, efficient lift from well-designed airfoils, a strong and relatively lightweight structure from stressed skin aluminum construction, and powerful, reliable engines, specifically the Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp, a 14-cylinder radial engine producing about 1,000 horsepower each, and the DC-3 had 2 of them. But what's really fascinating about the DC-3 era is what was happening inside the wings, because the airfoil shapes being used were no longer just intuitive guesses or copies of bird wings. They were the product of systematic scientific research, and the organization responsible for that research was the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, established by the United States Congress in 1915. And NACA is one of those organizations that quietly shaped the modern world in ways most people never think about. You've heard of NASA, right? Well, NACA was its predecessor. The A stood for aeronautics instead of space. And before it became NASA in 1958, it spent over 4 decades doing something beautifully methodical. It tested airfoil shapes, thousands of them, systematically, rigorously, in carefully controlled wind tunnels, and then it published the results for anyone to use. Free, open. Here's the data. Go build better airplanes. And this matters enormously, because before NACA got serious about airfoil cataloging, wing design was still partly art and partly guesswork. Different designers used different shapes, tested them in different ways, and there was no common language for comparing one airfoil to another. You might have a wing shape that worked beautifully on one airplane, but if you wanted to use it on a different design with different speed and weight requirements, you had no reliable way to predict how it would perform. NACA changed that. Starting in the late 1920s and really hitting its stride in the 1930s, researchers at NACA's Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory in Hampton, Virginia, began a systematic program of testing airfoil sections in their variable density wind tunnel. This tunnel was special because it could pressurize the air inside, which let them match the Reynolds numbers of full-scale flight even while testing small models. Reynolds number. That's basically a way of capturing how air behaves at different combinations of speed, size, and air density. The way air flows over a tiny model at normal pressure isn't quite the same as how it flows over a full-size wing at altitude, but if you pressurize the tunnel, you can make the physics match. Clever, right? So out of this work came the famous NACA 4-digit airfoil series, and later the 5-digit series, and eventually the 6 series laminar flow airfoils. And here's what's beautiful about the 4-digit system. It turned an airfoil shape into a simple numerical description. Take the NACA 2412, one of the most commonly referenced airfoils in aviation history. That first digit, the 2, tells you the maximum camber of the airfoil is 2% of the chord length. The chord is just the straight line distance from the leading edge to the trailing edge of the wing. The second digit, 4, tells you that maximum camber occurs at 40% of the chord back from the leading edge. And the last 2 digits, 12, tell you the maximum thickness is 12% of the chord. So just from those 4 numbers, any engineer anywhere in the world could reconstruct the exact shape of that airfoil and know its aerodynamic characteristics, because NACA had published all the lift curves, drag polars, and pitching moment data. It was like a universal parts catalog for wing shapes. Think about what that meant for airplane design. Suddenly, an engineer sitting at a desk could look up exactly how much lift a given airfoil would produce at a given angle of attack, how much drag it would create, at what angle it would stall. They could compare dozens of shapes side by side on paper before ever building a single model. It democratized aerodynamic knowledge, and those NACA airfoils showed up everywhere. In the DC-3's wings, in World War II fighters, in post-war airliners. Some of them are still used today in general aviation aircraft. The NACA 23012, a 5-digit series airfoil, was particularly popular because it had good lift characteristics and gentle stall behavior, which is exactly what you want on an airplane that ordinary pilots are going to fly. Now, I mentioned stall behavior, and this is worth pausing on because stalling is one of those concepts that sounds simple but has real depth to it, and understanding it helps you understand a lot about how wings are designed. We touched on this way back when we talked about Otto Lilienthal. He died because his glider stalled. But what actually happens during a stall? Here's the thing. As you increase the angle of attack, tilt the wing's leading edge higher relative to the oncoming air, lift increases. The air flowing over the curved upper surface has to travel faster, pressure drops, and you get more lift. But there's a limit. At some critical angle, usually somewhere around 15 to 20 degrees depending on the airfoil, the airflow can no longer follow the curved upper surface. It separates. Instead of flowing smoothly and staying attached to the wing, the air breaks away and becomes turbulent, chaotic, swirling. And when that happens, lift drops dramatically and drag spikes. That's a stall. It has nothing to do with the engine stalling. It's purely an aerodynamic event. You can stall a wing at any speed and any altitude if you exceed that critical angle of attack. And here's where airfoil design gets really interesting, because different shapes stall differently. Some airfoils stall abruptly. Lift drops like a cliff edge, and the airplane might roll violently to one side because one wing stalls before the other. That's terrifying and dangerous. Other airfoils stall gently. Lift decreases gradually. There's plenty of warning in the form of buffeting, and the pilot has time to react by pushing the nose down to reduce the angle of attack. NACA's systematic testing quantified all of this. They could tell you not just the maximum lift coefficient of an airfoil, but the shape of the lift curve near stall, how abruptly it broke, how much drag increased. This data saved lives because it let designers choose airfoils with forgiving stall characteristics for training aircraft and passenger planes, while perhaps accepting more aggressive stall behavior on high-performance military aircraft, where the pilots were trained to handle it. But here's what's really clever about wing design, and this goes beyond just the airfoil section. Remember how we talked about the Spitfire's elliptical wing? That shape wasn't just about reducing induced drag, though it did that beautifully. It also affected stall behavior across the span of the wing. See, on a real three-dimensional wing, not every part of the wing stalls at the same time. Ideally, you want the stall to begin at the wing root, the part closest to the fuselage, and progress outward toward the tips. Why? Because your ailerons, the control surfaces that let you roll the airplane, are out near the wingtips. If the tips stall first, you lose roll control at exactly the moment you need it most. That's how spins start, and spins kill people. So designers use a trick called washout. They twist the wing slightly so that the angle of attack at the tip is a few degrees less than at the root. That way, as the pilot pulls back and increases the overall angle of attack, the root reaches its critical angle first, starts to stall, and the pilot feels the buffet as a warning, while the tips are still flying and the ailerons still work. Some designers also use different airfoil sections at the root and the tip, a thicker, higher lift section at the root and a thinner one at the tip, to further tailor the stall progression. It's remarkably thoughtful engineering, all in service of keeping the airplane controllable at its most vulnerable moment. So by the late 1930s, you had this convergence of mature knowledge, NACA airfoil data, stressed skin aluminum construction, retractable landing gear, variable pitch, and then constant speed propellers, enclosed cockpits, reliable high-power radial engines. And all of it came together in airplanes that were dramatically more capable than anything from even a decade earlier. The state-of-the-art in 1939 was almost unrecognizable compared to 1929. And then, of course, the Second World War accelerated everything at a pace that peacetime development could never have matched. The war pushed piston engine technology to its absolute limits. By 1945, engines like the Rolls-Royce Merlin and the Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp were producing 2,000 horsepower or more from designs that had started the war at half that output. Superchargers and turbochargers forced more air into the cylinders, letting engines maintain power at high altitudes where the air was thin. High-octane aviation fuel, particularly the 100-octane fuel that the Allies had access to in greater quantities than the Axis, allowed higher compression ratios and more aggressive supercharging without detonation. That's when the fuel-air mixture ignites uncontrollably instead of burning smoothly, and it can destroy an engine in seconds. The difference between 87-octane and 100-octane fuel was, in a very real sense, a strategic advantage measured in horsepower and altitude. But even as piston engines reached extraordinary levels of refinement, a completely different kind of propulsion was being born. And this is one of those stories where multiple people in multiple countries were converging on the same idea almost simultaneously, which tells you that the idea's time had come. The jet engine. The concept is deceptively simple, and it goes back to Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Instead of using a piston engine to turn a propeller, which pushes air backward to pull the airplane forward, what if you just took air in at the front, compressed it, mixed it with fuel, burned it, and let the hot expanding gases blast out the back? The reaction to that rearward blast of gas would push the airplane forward. No propeller needed. No reciprocating pistons. No crankshaft. No complex valve timing. Just continuous rotary motion, a compressor at the front, combustion chambers in the middle, and a turbine at the back that extracts just enough energy from the exhaust to keep the compressor spinning. Everything else blasts out the nozzle as thrust. The person who first patented this idea in a practical form was Frank Whittle, a young Royal Air Force officer, in 1930. He was only 23 years old. And here's what's remarkable about Whittle. He wasn't just a pilot. He was genuinely brilliant at engineering and physics, and he could see something that most of the aviation establishment couldn't. He understood that propeller-driven aircraft would hit a speed wall. As an airplane approaches the speed of sound, the tips of the propeller blades get there first, because they're already moving fast due to rotation, plus the airplane's forward speed. And when the blade tips go supersonic, efficiency collapses and drag explodes. Whittle saw this coming and realized that jet propulsion would be the way past it. But almost nobody took him seriously. The Air Ministry showed little interest. He couldn't get funding. He actually let his patent lapse in 1935 because he couldn't afford the £5 renewal fee. £5. Think about that. One of the most important aviation patents of the 20th century, abandoned for want of £5. Meanwhile, in Germany, a young physicist named Hans von Ohain was independently developing his own jet engine design with the backing of aircraft manufacturer Ernst Heinkel. And it was Ohain's engine that flew first, the Heinkel. E-178 made the world's first jet-powered flight on August 27, 1939, just days before Germany invaded Poland. Whittle's engine didn't fly until May 1941 in the Gloucester E-28/39, but both engines worked on the same fundamental principle, and both men deserve credit as co-inventors of the turbojet. They actually met years later, in the 1960s, and by all accounts had enormous mutual respect. Now, the early jet engines were, let's be honest, pretty terrible by modern standards. They guzzled fuel at an alarming rate. The turbine blades couldn't handle the heat and had to be replaced after just a few dozen hours of operation, and the engines were unreliable. The materials science simply wasn't there yet. Turbine blades sit in a stream of combustion gases that can exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius, and they're spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, which means they're experiencing enormous centrifugal forces trying to tear them apart, all while being blasted with heat that wants to soften and melt them. It's one of the most punishing environments in all of engineering. And the story of how jet engines went from those fragile, fuel-hungry early designs to the astonishingly efficient and reliable power plants on modern airliners. That story is really a story about materials science, about metallurgy, about the invention of superalloys and eventually single crystal turbine blades, and about a concept called bypass ratio that completely changed what a jet engine is for. So let's talk about bypass ratio, because it's one of those ideas that sounds technical, but is actually beautifully simple once you see it. Think about what a jet engine does at its most basic level. It takes in air, compresses it, mixes it with fuel, burns it, and shoots the hot exhaust out the back. Newton's third law: every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That exhaust rushing backward pushes the engine and the airplane attached to it forward. Straightforward enough. But here's the question that engineers started asking in the 1950s. What's the most efficient way to produce thrust? And the answer turns out to be a little counterintuitive. You get more thrust per unit of fuel not by shooting a small amount of air out the back really, really fast, but by pushing a large amount of air out the back at a more moderate speed. It's the same total momentum change, same thrust, but the slower moving larger mass of air wastes less energy. Less energy wasted as noise, less energy wasted as heat in the exhaust. It's just more efficient. So imagine you take your jet engine core, the compressor, combustion chamber, and turbine, that whole hot, screaming heart of the thing, and you put a really big fan on the front of it, a fan much wider than the core itself. This fan is driven by the turbine at the back, so the hot core is essentially acting as a gas generator to spin this enormous fan. Now, most of the air that the fan pulls in doesn't go through the core at all. It goes around the outside, through a duct that bypasses the combustion process entirely. It just gets pushed backward by the fan, a huge volume of cool air moving at moderate speed. That bypass air produces most of the thrust. The hot core exhaust still contributes, but the bypass air is doing the heavy lifting. The ratio of how much air goes around the core versus through it, that's your bypass ratio. Early turbojets, the kind Whittle and O'Hain built, had a bypass ratio of 0. All the air went through the core. The first turbofan engines in the late 1950s and early 1960s had bypass ratios of maybe 1:1 or 2:1. Modern high-bypass turbofans on the airliners you fly on today, they have bypass ratios of 10:1, 12:1, even higher. The newest engines from Rolls-Royce and CFM are pushing past 13:1. That means for every unit of air going through the hot core, 13 units are being pushed around the outside by that big fan. And that's why modern jet engines are so much quieter and so much more fuel efficient than the engines of the 1960s. That roar you associate with old jet footage, that tremendous howl, that was the sound of a pure turbojet or a low bypass engine converting fuel into noise. The sound of a modern high bypass turbofan is more of a whoosh, a rush of air. Still loud, absolutely, but it's a fundamentally different character, because most of what you're hearing is just moved air, not combustion exhaust. Now, making this work, making a fan that's 8, 9, 10 feet in diameter, spinning it at thousands of RPM, keeping it balanced, keeping it efficient, making the blades the right shape so they don't stall at the root or go supersonic at the tips. That's an enormous engineering challenge all by itself. The fan blades on a modern engine like the GE9X, which powers the Boeing 777X, are made of carbon fiber composites, each one carefully laid up and cured to exact specifications. They're lighter than the titanium blades they replaced, and they can flex and absorb impacts, which matters when you consider that these engines occasionally ingest birds, hail, even chunks of ice that break off other parts of the airplane. There are certification tests where engineers literally fire dead chickens into a running engine from a cannon to make sure it can survive a bird strike without coming apart catastrophically. That's a real thing. It's called the bird ingestion test, and it's required by the FAA and EASA before any engine can be certified for commercial flight. But the fan is only part of the story. Let's go back to those turbine blades sitting in the hot core, because that's where the materials science gets truly extraordinary. Remember, the turbine blades are right behind the combustion chamber. They're the first things the hot gas hits after the fuel burns, and in a modern engine, those gases can be 1,400, 1,500 degrees Celsius. Here's what's wild about that. The melting point of the nickel-based superalloys those blades are made from is around 1,300 to 1,400 degrees. The gas is hotter than the melting point of the blade. Let that sink in for a second. The blade is sitting in gas that should, by all rights, melt it. And yet it doesn't melt. How? 3 things, working together. First, the blade is cooled internally. Each turbine blade is hollow, with an incredibly intricate network of tiny cooling channels running through it. Cool air bled from the compressor section is routed through these channels, flowing through the inside of the blade and then out through hundreds of tiny holes on the blade's surface. This creates a thin film of cooler air that clings to the outside of the blade, insulating it from the worst of the heat. It's called film cooling. And the pattern of those holes, their size, angle, spacing, distribution, is one of the most closely guarded trade secrets in the engine business. Second, the blades are coated with a thermal barrier coating, a thin ceramic layer that acts like an insulating blanket, reducing the heat that actually reaches the metal underneath. And third, and this is the part that really gets me, the blades themselves are single crystals. Normally, when you cast a metal part, the metal solidifies into millions of tiny crystals, or grains, all oriented in random directions. The boundaries between those grains are weak points. Under the extreme heat and centrifugal stress inside a turbine, those grain boundaries are where cracks start. They're where the metal creeps, slowly deforms under sustained load at high temperature. So in the 1960s and 1970s, metallurgists started figuring out how to control the crystal structure of turbine blades. First came directionally solidified blades, where all the grains were aligned in the same direction, along the length of the blade, so there were no grain boundaries running across the direction of centrifugal force. That was a big improvement. But then, in the late 1960s, researchers at Pratt & Whitney developed a process to cast each blade as a single crystal. One grain. No grain boundaries at all. The entire blade, with all its complex curves and internal cooling passages, is a single unbroken crystal of nickel superalloy. The casting process is remarkable. You start with a wax model of the blade, perfect in every detail including those tiny cooling channels. You coat the wax in ceramic to make a mold, then melt the wax out, leaving a hollow ceramic shell. You pour molten superalloy into this mold, and here's the key. You cool it from the bottom up, very slowly, through a narrow constriction called a grain selector. The grain selector is shaped like a pigtail or a spiral, and it's designed so that only one crystal orientation can make it through the passage. As the metal solidifies upward from that single seed, the entire blade forms as one crystal. The process takes hours. The temperature gradients have to be controlled with extraordinary precision. If anything goes wrong, a vibration, a temperature fluctuation, a tiny crack in the ceramic mold, you get a stray grain, and the blade is scrap. The rejection rates are significant, and each blade can cost tens of thousands of dollars. A single high-pressure turbine disc in a modern engine might have 60 or 70 of these blades, and each one has been X-rayed, ultrasonically inspected, and examined for any flaw before it ever sees service. And here's what all of this buys you. By allowing higher turbine inlet temperatures, you extract more energy from the combustion gases, which means you can drive a bigger fan, which means more bypass air, which means more thrust per pound of fuel burned. It all connects. The materials science enables the thermodynamics, enables the efficiency. Every 50-degree increase in allowable turbine temperature translates to meaningful gains in engine performance. That's why engine manufacturers spend billions on turbine blade research. It's why Rolls-Royce, GE, and Pratt & Whitney guard their casting techniques and alloy compositions like state secrets. Because in the world of commercial aviation, where fuel is the single largest operating cost for airlines, even a 1 or 2% improvement in specific fuel consumption can be worth hundreds of millions of dollars across a fleet over a decade. And the improvements have been staggering. A modern high-bypass turbofan, like the CFM LEAP or the Pratt & Whitney PW 1000G geared turbofan, burns something like 15 to 20% less fuel per passenger mile than the engines it replaced, which were themselves far more efficient than the generation before. Compared to the early turbojets of the 1950s, the improvement is on the order of 70%. 70% less fuel to move a person the same distance through the sky. That's not one breakthrough. That's decades of incremental, painstaking refinement in aerodynamics, materials, cooling, manufacturing, and engine architecture all compounding together. The geared turbofan, actually, is worth a moment of your time because it's a clever solution to a problem that becomes more pressing as bypass ratios keep climbing. See, in a traditional turbofan, the fan at the front is connected to the same shaft as the low-pressure turbine at the back. They spin at the same speed. But as fans get bigger, and they need to get bigger for higher bypass ratios, you want the fan to spin slower because the tips of those long blades will go supersonic if you spin them too fast. And that kills efficiency and creates tremendous noise. Meanwhile, the low-pressure turbine actually wants to spin faster because turbines are more efficient at higher speeds. So you've got a conflict. The fan wants to go slow, the turbine wants to go fast, and they're bolted to the same shaft. Pratt & Whitney's solution was to put a gearbox between them, a planetary gear system that lets the turbine spin about 3 times faster than the fan. It's conceptually simple, but mechanically extraordinary, because this gearbox has to transmit tens of thousands of horsepower reliably for tens of thousands of hours in an environment of extreme vibration and thermal cycling. The engineering that went into that gearbox is a story all its own, the tolerances, the lubrication, the materials, but it works, and it allows you to optimize the fan and the turbine independently, which is why the PW 1000G is one of the most fuel-efficient engines ever built. So you've got these modern engines that are marvels of thermodynamics and materials science, hanging on wings that are themselves marvels of structural and aerodynamic engineering. And those wings are connected to fuselages built from increasingly advanced materials, aluminum-lithium alloys that are lighter and stiffer than traditional aluminum, carbon fiber reinforced polymers that make up more than 50% of the structural weight of the Boeing 787 and the Airbus A350. The 787 was actually the first major commercial airliner with a composite fuselage, and that was a huge deal when it was announced, because composites behave very differently from metals. They don't corrode, which is wonderful, but they also don't show damage the same way. You can dent aluminum and see it. Composite structures can suffer internal delamination, layers separating inside the material that's invisible from the surface. So entirely new inspection techniques and damage tolerance philosophies had to be developed. The certification process for the 787's composite fuselage took years and involved testing that had never been done before at that scale. And this connects to something we should talk about, because it's one of the most important and least visible aspects of how modern airplanes work: the philosophy of structural design, and how engineers ensure that an airplane stays in one piece for decades of service. It's a concept called damage tolerance, and it grew out of some very painful lessons learned from real-world catastrophes that nobody saw coming until it was too late. The story that changed everything, the one that forced the entire aviation industry to rethink how it designs and certifies airplanes, starts with a name you might have heard before: the de Havilland Comet. We touched on jet engines earlier, how Whittle and O'Hane independently cracked the concept, how those early turbojets were thirsty and loud, but pointed the way forward. Well, the Comet was where jet-powered commercial aviation truly began, and it was a gorgeous airplane, sleek, fast, pressurized, with 4 ghost turbojet engines buried elegantly inside the wing roots. It entered service with BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, in May of 1952, and it was a revelation. Passengers who had endured the noise and vibration of piston-powered airliners suddenly found themselves gliding above the weather at 40,000 feet in relative quiet, getting to their destinations in half the time. Britain was justifiably proud. This was their airplane, their technology, their moment to lead the world in civil aviation. And then, in January of 1954, a comet broke apart in flight over the Mediterranean near the island of Elba. BOAC Flight 781 out of Rome, climbing through 36,000 feet. All 35 people on board were killed. The fleet was grounded, investigated, and then, after modifications that were thought to address the problem, put back into service. 3 months later, in April 1954, it happened again. South African Airways Flight 201, another comet, broke apart over the sea near Naples. 21 people lost. The comet fleet was grounded permanently this time, and what followed was one of the most remarkable forensic investigations in engineering history. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, led by a brilliant structural engineer named Arnold Hall, undertook something extraordinary. They took an entire Comet fuselage, a complete airframe that had already accumulated about a third of its expected service life in actual flights, and placed it inside a massive water tank. Then they pressurized and depressurized it, over and over, simulating the stress cycle that happens every single time an airplane climbs to altitude and comes back down. Every flight, the fuselage inflates slightly like a balloon as the cabin is pressurized and then relaxes when it descends. That's one cycle. And they just kept cycling it, thousands of times, while the water tank contained the energy so that if the fuselage failed, it wouldn't explode like a bomb. It would just crack, and they could find the crack. After the equivalent of about 9,000 total flights, the fuselage failed. A crack originated at the corner of one of the rectangular window cutouts, specifically a corner of the automatic direction finder window near the top of the fuselage. And when investigators recovered wreckage from the Mediterranean and pieced it together, literally laying out thousands of fragments on a huge frame, like the world's most tragic jigsaw puzzle, they found the same thing. Cracks starting at the corners of the square windows, propagating through the skin until the fuselage tore open catastrophically. Here's the thing about why this happened, and it's worth understanding because it touches on a concept that governs how every airplane flying today is designed. The concept is metal fatigue. When you bend a paperclip back and forth, it gets warm at the bend point, and eventually it snaps. The metal hasn't exceeded its ultimate strength in any single bend. You're not pulling it hard enough to break it in one go. But each cycle of bending creates and extends tiny cracks at the microscopic level, and over many cycles, those cracks grow until the remaining material can't hold, and it fractures suddenly. That's fatigue. And the critical insight is that stress concentrations, places where the geometry of the structure focuses stress into a small area, are where fatigue cracks love to start. A square window corner is a stress concentration. Think about it this way. If you take a sheet of rubber and stretch it, the tension distributes pretty evenly across the whole sheet. But if you cut a small square hole in the middle and stretch it again, the stress flows around that hole like water flowing around a rock in a stream. And right at the sharp corners of that square, the stress piles up dramatically. It can be 2, 3, even more times higher than the stress in the rest of the sheet. The metal at those corners is working much harder than the metal everywhere else. And when you cycle that stress thousands of times, pressurize, depressurize, pressurize, depressurize, fatigue cracks initiate right there at those corners, and they grow a tiny bit with each cycle until one day the crack reaches a critical length and the whole thing unzips. The fix, in one sense, was almost embarrassingly simple. Round windows, oval windows. Eliminate the sharp corners, and you eliminate the worst stress concentrations. And the fatigue life of the structure improves enormously. Every commercial airplane since the comet has had oval or round windows, and now you know exactly why. Next time you're on a plane, or next time you remember being on one, picture those rounded corners and think about the comet, and the 35 people on Flight 781, and the 21 on Flight 201, whose deaths taught the industry this lesson. But the deeper legacy of the comet disasters went far beyond window shapes. It fundamentally changed how engineers think about structural integrity. Before the comet, the prevailing philosophy was what you might call safe life design. You calculated how long a structure should last based on the expected loads, you added a generous safety factor, and you declared that the structure was good for that many hours or that many flights. When the safe life was reached, you retired the part or the airplane. The assumption was that if you designed it strong enough and didn't exceed the safe life, cracks wouldn't be a problem. The comet showed that this assumption was dangerously optimistic. Real structures develop cracks earlier than predicted. Manufacturing imperfections, tiny scratches, rivet holes, corrosion. All of these create initiation sites for fatigue cracks that the safe life calculations might not account for. So the industry began shifting toward a new philosophy, fail-safe design. The idea here is that you assume cracks will form. You don't try to prevent them entirely because you can't. But you design the structure so that if one element fails, the load is carried by alternative paths. Redundancy. If a skin panel cracks, the adjacent stringers and frames pick up the load and prevent catastrophic failure. The crack is contained. The airplane can make it home safely. The crack is found during inspection, and the part is repaired or replaced. This was a huge conceptual shift. You're no longer designing to prevent failure. You're designing to survive failure. And that philosophy evolved further over the decades, driven by more painful lessons. In 1988, Aloha Airlines Flight 243, a Boeing 737, lost a massive section of its upper fuselage skin during flight at 24,000 feet. About 18 feet of fuselage roof just peeled away. One flight attendant was killed, swept out of the airplane. The pilots managed an emergency landing, which was itself extraordinary. The cause was widespread fatigue damage. The airplane had accumulated nearly 90,000 flight cycles, many of them short island-hopping flights in the humid, salty Hawaiian environment, which accelerated corrosion and fatigue. Multiple small cracks at rivet holes had linked up into one long crack, and the fail-safe features that were supposed to contain damage were themselves compromised by the same widespread fatigue. This led to the current philosophy, which is called damage tolerance. And damage tolerance is, in a way, the most honest and mature approach to structural engineering. It says, cracks will form. We know they will. We can even predict approximately where they'll form and how fast they'll grow, because we understand fracture mechanics, the science of how cracks propagate through materials under cyclic loading. So we design the structure to be inspectable at those critical locations. We calculate how fast a crack can grow before it reaches a dangerous size, and we set inspection intervals that are shorter than that growth period. The idea is that you will always catch a crack while it's still small and safe, long before it could cause a catastrophic failure. Think about what that means in practice. Every commercial airplane flying today has a detailed inspection program that specifies exactly which parts of the structure need to be checked, how often, and using what method. Visual inspection, ultrasonic testing, eddy current testing, X-ray. The intervals are based on crack growth analysis. Engineers know that a fatigue crack in a particular location, in that particular alloy, under those particular stress levels, will grow at a certain rate per flight cycle. They know the critical crack length, the size at which the crack becomes unstable and could lead to rapid fracture, and they set the inspection interval to be a fraction of the time it would take a crack to grow from detectable size to critical size. Usually they use a factor of 2 or 3, so if a crack would take, say, 6,000 flights to grow from detectable to critical, the inspection interval might be set at 2,000 or 3,000 flights. And this is where composites make things interesting again, circling back to the 787 and the A350. Because composites don't fatigue the same way metals do. Carbon fiber reinforced polymer doesn't develop the same kind of slowly growing cracks. Instead, the failure modes are different: delamination, fiber breakage, matrix cracking, and they're harder to detect and harder to predict. You can't always see them from the outside. You can't always find them with the same techniques that work on metal. So the damage tolerance philosophy had to be adapted. New inspection methods were developed: thermography, laser shearography, advanced ultrasonic techniques that can map internal delaminations, and the certification requirements for composite structures are in some ways even more stringent than for metal ones, because the industry is still building experience with how these materials age over decades of service. Now, here's something quietly remarkable about all of this. The result of these painful lessons, these decades of evolving design philosophy, these ever more sophisticated inspection programs, is that commercial aviation has become astonishingly safe. The fatal accident rate for commercial jet airliners has dropped by orders of magnitude since the 1950s. In recent years, The odds of being killed on a commercial flight are roughly 1 in several million. You are safer in a modern airliner than you are driving to the airport. And that safety isn't the result of any single brilliant invention. It's the accumulated wisdom of thousands of engineers, investigators, regulators, and yes, the people who didn't survive the lessons that taught us what we know. And that really is the thread that runs through everything we've talked about tonight. From those first dreamers watching birds and strapping wings to their arms, through Cayley's quiet genius, Lilienthal's fatal stall, the Wright's stubborn methodical brilliance, the Schneider trophy racers pushing airframes to their limits, Whittle scribbling equations for a jet engine that nobody believed in, the metallurgists growing single crystals of nickel superalloy so a turbine blade could survive temperatures beyond its own melting point. All of it is the same story. It's the story of people looking at the sky and refusing to accept that they couldn't get up there, and then, once they got up there, refusing to accept that they couldn't do it better, faster, safer, more efficiently. Every piece of an airplane is a solution to a problem that somebody, somewhere, struggled with. The wing shape is an answer to Cayley's question about how to generate lift without flapping. The ailerons are the Wright's answer to the problem of roll control, refined and improved over a century. The turbofan engine is the answer to the question of how to make jet propulsion efficient enough for everyday travel. The rounded windows are the answer written in the lives lost over the Mediterranean in 1954. The inspection schedule taped to the maintenance office wall is the answer to Aloha Flight 243. And the airplane you'll fly on next, whenever that is, will be the sum of all those answers. Millions of them, layered on top of each other, tested and proven and refined. You'll settle into your seat. The engines will spool up with that deep, building whine. The acceleration will press you gently back, and the nose will rotate upward, and the ground will fall away. And in that moment, everything we've talked about tonight will be happening all at once. Bernoulli's pressure differential and Newton's momentum change creating lift across the wing, the boundary layer clinging to the carefully shaped airfoil surface, the turbine blades spinning in their superalloy perfection, the bypass air flowing cold and fast through the nacelle, the fuselage holding its pressure against the thin cold air outside, the structure flexing exactly as it was designed to flex, the cracks that haven't formed yet already accounted for in an inspection schedule that some engineer calculated years ago. You won't think about any of it. You'll put on your headphones, or close your eyes, or watch the clouds slide by below you. And that's fine. That's the whole point, really. The best engineering is the kind you never have to think about. It just works. It carries you where you need to go, quietly, reliably, and brings you back down again. And tonight, you don't need to go anywhere. You're right where you should be. The story's been told, the engines are winding down, and the air is still. So let it all go. The lift and the drag, the thrust and the weight, the rivets and the alloys and the turbine blades. Let them settle like the last slow turn of a propeller after the engine shuts off, each revolution a little slower than the last, until everything is quiet and still, and you can rest